What if I told you that 400 tons of gold was stolen from one of the most secure locations in the entire world? And then I told you that not only have the thieves not been caught, but the crime has never even been officially acknowledged. If you were a cynic, you might say it sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory. But what if I told you it's actually fact? Welcome to my channel, and today we're answering the extraordinary question, where is the missing gold of Fort Knox? In the vaults deep beneath the United States Bullion Depository at Fort Knox, Kentucky, there is supposed to be 400 tons of gold. However, in 1926, an audit found out that there was only 300 tons. Since then, no one has been able to account for the other 100 tons. And while some claim that the gold is still sitting in a vault somewhere, others say it was lost forever when the HMS Titan exploded. Is there any truth to these claims, or is there a more nefarious explanation behind the missing metal? Let's take a look back to find out. From the very beginning, Fort Knox was designed to be one of the most secure buildings on Earth. The structure was built between 1936 and 1938 during the Great Depression, largely in response to citizens who were concerned about the declining value of the U.S. dollar. It was intended as a way of providing Americans with a tangible asset they could fall back on. The building itself is almost impenetrable, constructed from 650,000 cubic feet of concrete and steel with walls that are 2.5 feet thick. Only 8 people are allowed in the vault at any given time, and anyone entering must pass through 2 sets of steel doors. Cameras monitor the area and armed guards patrol outside. By 1941, the facility was complete, and it opened its doors for the first time. By this point, the U.S. Treasury had acquired 46 million ounces of gold, which had been mined across the country and deposited in banks around New York City. Transporting all of this gold was risky, so it was decided that it would be moved to Kentucky. Originally, the gold was set to be transported by train, but this plan was scrapped after Franklin D. Roosevelt deemed the route to be unsafe. Instead, it was loaded onto 6 naval vessels and escorted by 6 destroyers. Once it reached Fort Knox, each bar of gold was carefully counted before being sealed in individual airtight bags. They were then placed inside of 400-gallon steel drums filled with an inert substance called perlite. These drums were stored in 45-foot steel vaults that lay 65 feet underground. For many years, this gold remained undisturbed until 1926, when officials decided that it needed to be audited. When the gold was unpacked, it became apparent that something was wrong. A total of 399 tons of gold was found, and 4,841 of the 400 troy-ounce bars were missing. This meant that roughly 100 tons of the precious metal was gone without a trace. Of course, this led to mass panic. Everyone wanted to know how so much gold could have been stolen without anyone noticing. At the time, the Treasury Secretary denied that there was any foul play involved. Instead, he blamed the discrepancy on a miscount that had taken place in 1937. But given the sheer volume of gold that was missing, this explanation didn't wash with everyone. Many people suspected that the gold had been melted down and sold off in Europe. After all, this was just a few years after the Great Depression, and people were desperate for money. Others believed that the gold had simply been misplaced and would turn up eventually. In order to get to the bottom of the mystery, an investigation was launched. The man in charge of the operation was an accountant named J.W. Treasure. Along with several of his colleagues, Treasure began poring over records trying to find a mistake that could explain the missing gold. Their work didn't turn up anything useful until they came across the logbook of a tugboat. This boat had been hired to transport the gold from the docks in New York to the waiting ships that would take it to Fort Knox. After poring over the book, Treasure found that on one day, 4 of the steel drums had gone missing. According to the ship's log, the captain had noticed that the seal on the cargo had been broken and the number of drums had been altered. He had reported this immediately, and new seals had been affixed. Unfortunately, when the cargo arrived in Kentucky, nobody had checked the numbers to make sure that everything matched up. As a result, the faulty records had gone unnoticed for years. With this evidence, Treasure informed the press that the gold was still in the possession of the government and no theft had taken place. Despite this, the story made headlines across the world, and people couldn't believe that such a huge error could have been made. Over the next few decades, rumors persisted that the gold had in fact been stolen and hidden away by criminals or corrupt government officials. While none of these theories could be substantiated, many people refused to believe that it was simply a case of misplaced paperwork. One of the biggest problems with the official explanation is that there's no way for us to prove it. We don't know what the records looked like back then, so we can't check them to see if they were tampered with. And unfortunately, we don't have any pictures of the cargo either. Because the government took such pains to hide the location of the gold, it's possible that the records were correct and that the gold is still somewhere out there. But where is it now? Well, according to some, the gold is still at Fort Knox, but it's not where it used to be. After the 1926 audit, the facility underwent some changes. Perhaps the most important of these was the removal of the 40-foot steel vaults that had been housing the gold. In their place, the depository installed 600-gallon concrete vaults. According to the director of Fort Knox himself, the old vaults were removed and scrapped, meaning that the gold was likely transferred to the new structures. If that's true, then the missing gold should still be somewhere within the facility. However, many people disagree. In fact, some claim that the entire story of the missing gold is a cover-up for something much bigger. In 1980, a former employee named Arthur C. Burton published a book called The Missing Gold of Fort Knox. In it, he claimed that 300 of the 400 tons of missing gold had actually been loaded onto the HMS Titan. The Titan was a British passenger liner that was requisitioned by the Royal Navy during the Second World War. It was used to transport gold and other valuable materials around the Atlantic. On September 1941, the ship exploded off the coast of Ireland, killing everyone on board. To this day, it's unknown what caused the explosion, but many believe that a German U-boat was responsible. What makes this theory particularly interesting is that the disaster happened just months after the gold was moved to Fort Knox. It's possible that the cargo was never switched over and was lost when the Titan sank. However, this is highly unlikely since the loss of the Titan was widely publicized at the time and nobody connected it to the missing gold. There is another theory which suggests that the gold was stolen and melted down, then shipped out in smaller quantities on passenger liners. According to this account, the person responsible was a man named Bernard von Nathaus. Von Nathaus was a Swiss banker who specialized in moving illicit funds around the world. He worked with Nazi Germany during the war and was rumored to have ties to the mafia. Some people believe that von Nathaus used his expertise to steal the gold from Fort Knox and distribute it amongst various criminal organizations. If true, this would explain why so much gold went missing at once. There was no single thief who could have carried the weight. Instead, it was stolen by a group working together. Unfortunately, there is little evidence to support this theory, but it does explain the crime better than the official narrative. In 1974, author Gary Allen wrote a story called The Secret History of Fort Knox. In it, he proposed yet another solution to the missing gold. According to Allen, the gold was never in the possession of the government at all. Instead, it belonged to the Bank of England and was merely held at Fort Knox as a temporary measure. Allen says that when the gold was transferred in 1926, a clerical error was made. The Bank of England was supposed to receive 400 tons, but instead received 300 tons. Rather than admit their mistake, the bank and the government conspired to cover it up. This would explain why no foul play was ever suspected since there was no theft involved. However, it doesn't explain why the U.S. government went to such lengths to keep the location of the gold a secret. Unfortunately, the truth may never come out. The gold at Fort Knox is still there, but it's inaccessible to the public. And even the official records relating to the depository have been sealed for 70 years. It appears as though we may never know exactly how 100 tons of gold vanished into thin air. But one thing's for certain. The security measures at Fort Knox are so tight that it would be almost impossible to pull off a heist of that magnitude today. Now watch what really happened to Al Capone, or check out who owns the most gold in the world.